At exactly 7:14 a.m., on a quiet morning that looked no different from any other, a security guard made a decision that would quietly set off a chain of events no one in that building was prepared for. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. He simply looked at the woman standing in front of him, took in her clothes, her posture, the absence of a visible badge, and reached for the nearest tool beside him, a mop. He handed it to her with the casual certainty of someone who believed he understood exactly who she was and exactly why she was there. And in that small, ordinary moment, something deeply consequential began to unfold. Because the woman he had just redirected wasn't part of the cleaning staff. She wasn't lost. She wasn't new. She was the architect of everything around him. The facility, the systems, the protocols, even the contract that governed his own authority. And within the next hour, everything he thought he knew would collapse. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was she really? That question lingered long after the moment had passed, long after the mop had been handed over and the assumption had been made. Because nothing about her presence that morning was random, and nothing about what followed could be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. Why didn't she correct him? Why didn't she stop the moment, explain who she was, and walk past him the way someone in her position easily could have? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how did one brief exchange, lasting less than 3 minutes, go on to trigger a policy shift that would ripple far beyond a single building, far beyond a single company, and into institutions across the country? To understand that, you have to understand where this happened. The facility stood on federal land, a $340 million research complex built to house some of the most advanced scientific work in the nation. Every door, every hallway, every access point inside that building operated under strict layers of authority. Security wasn't just a formality. It was a system built on control, verification, and absolute confidence in who belonged and who did not. At the top of that structure were federal administrators and division leads. Beneath them, layers of contractors, supervisors, and security personnel, each responsible for enforcing rules they did not create but were expected to follow without hesitation. And standing quietly at the center of that entire system that morning was a woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter. Her name was written into the foundation of the facility in ways no one at that checkpoint could see. She had spent years securing funding, designing operational frameworks, and shaping the very protocols that governed access to the building, including the ones that gave that security guard his authority, the same authority he had just used to deny her entry. So why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she correct the mistake the moment it happened? The answer to that question changes everything about how this story is understood. Because what looked like a simple error wasn't an accident at all. It was something far more deliberate, something planned, something measured. Because by the time she stepped onto that property that morning, Dr. Evelyn Carter wasn't just arriving for work. She was testing a system she already suspected was broken. And what happened next would prove exactly how deep that problem went. Long before that morning at 7:14 a.m., long before the guard reached for the mop and made a decision he believed was routine, Dr. Evelyn Carter had already built a reputation that few in her field could match. She was not someone who arrived at the top by chance. Her path had been defined by precision, discipline, and a level of focus that people who worked alongside her often described as relentless in the best possible way. She had studied at some of the most respected institutions in the country, earning advanced degrees in physics and systems engineering, and quickly became known not just for her intelligence, but for her ability to translate complex ideas into real-world infrastructure. Where others saw theory, she saw application. Where others saw limitations, she saw design problems waiting to be solved. When the federal government approved funding for the $340 million research facility, it wasn't simply another project assigned to a team. It was a long-term initiative that required someone who could think beyond construction timelines and budgets, someone who understood how to build not just a structure, but an ecosystem. Dr. Evelyn Carter became that person. She helped shape the early proposals, guided the technical direction, and played a central role in determining how the facility would function once it was operational. From the placement of secure access points to the hierarchy of clearance levels, her influence was embedded in every layer of the building. Even the contract that governed the security team, including the policies they were trained to enforce, carried her input in ways that most of them would never realize. Colleagues described her as measured and deliberate, someone who rarely spoke without purpose and never acted without thinking several steps ahead. She wasn't known for dramatic reactions or impulsive decisions. Instead, she approached problems the way she approached everything else, by observing carefully, gathering information, and responding with clarity. It was part of the reason she was trusted with a project of that scale. In environments where mistakes could carry serious consequences, her consistency made her stand out. She wasn't just respected for what she knew, but for how she applied it. But for all the recognition she had earned within professional circles, there were moments that existed outside those environments. Moments where her credentials were invisible, where assumptions were made before she had a chance to speak. Moments that didn't align with the reputation she had built, but occurred anyway. And while each of those moments may have seemed small in isolation, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Because this wasn't the first time she had been underestimated. To understand how that moment at the checkpoint could even happen, you have to look beyond the individual and examine the system he was operating inside. Facilities like this don't rely on a single layer of authority. They are built on a network of contractors, protocols, and enforcement structures designed to function with consistency, regardless of who is on duty. The security team stationed at the entrance that morning wasn't directly employed by the federal agency overseeing the building. They were part of a private security firm, brought in through a multi-million-dollar contract to manage access control, enforce identification procedures, and maintain order during the facility's pre-opening phase. Their job was clear: verify credentials, control entry points, and make decisions quickly. Within that structure, hierarchy mattered. Guards reported to supervisors, supervisors reported to regional managers, and all of them operated under a set of written policies that defined how authority should be exercised. Those policies outlined when to grant access, when to deny it, and how to respond when something didn't match expectations. But like any system that depends on human judgment, there was always a space between what was written and how it was applied in real time. That space is where perception begins to influence decision-making. Because in environments like this, decisions often happen in seconds, based not only on procedure, but on interpretation. The guard who stood at that checkpoint that morning believed he was doing exactly what he had been trained to do. He saw someone without visible credentials, someone who did not match his internal picture of who belonged in that space, and he acted accordingly. From his perspective, it was a routine call. From the outside, it was something else entirely. Because in facilities like this, access isn't just about identity, it's about perception. And perception, when left unchecked, has a way of reshaping reality in ways that no protocol can fully control. At 7:14 a.m., the facility was still quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before a place begins to move with purpose. The parking lot was only partially filled, and the air carried that early morning stillness where every sound felt slightly amplified. Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped out of her car without drawing attention, dressed simply, carrying a tote bag, moving with the same calm focus that had defined her entire career. There was nothing about her appearance that signaled authority to someone who didn't already know who she was. No visible badge, no formal introduction, no immediate display of status. Just a woman walking toward a building she had spent years helping bring to life. As she approached the security checkpoint, the guard standing near the entrance shifted his posture slightly, watching her with a level of attention that suggested he had already begun forming a conclusion. By the time she reached him, that conclusion had settled into certainty. He spoke first, his tone controlled but firm, asking for credentials in the way someone does when they expect compliance, not conversation. Dr. Evelyn Carter responded calmly, explaining that she was authorized to be there, that she worked in the facility, that she could provide identification. Her voice carried no urgency, no frustration, just clarity. But the guard didn't adjust. Instead, he focused on what he could see, or more accurately, what he believed he was seeing. No badge, no visible confirmation, no reason, in his mind, to reconsider. The exchange remained brief, but something in his demeanor shifted from procedural to dismissive. It wasn't overt. It didn't require raised voices. It was subtle, embedded in the way he repeated his request, in the way he stood his ground without entertaining the possibility that he might be mistaken. For the viewer, the tension builds not from what is said, but from what is being ignored. Dr. Evelyn Carter made one more attempt to clarify, reaching toward her bag as if to retrieve proof, but before she could fully present it, the guard made a decision that closed the conversation. He redirected her, not toward verification, but toward assumption. And then, he made a second assumption. He asked if she was there for the custodial orientation, referencing a staff briefing scheduled for later that morning. The question landed with a kind of casual certainty, as if it required no confirmation. For a brief moment, there was a pause. Not confusion, not hesitation, but something more deliberate. Dr. Evelyn Carter looked at him, absorbing the situation, measuring it in a way that wasn't immediately visible. And then, instead of correcting him, instead of asserting her position, she did something unexpected. She agreed. The decision seemed small in the moment, almost insignificant. She acknowledged the direction he gave, accepted the path he pointed her toward, and stepped away from the checkpoint without resistance. To anyone watching, it would have looked like compliance, like someone accepting their place within a structure they didn't question. But that interpretation would have missed what was actually happening beneath the surface. Because this wasn't submission. It wasn't confusion. It was calculation. That decision would change everything. As Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped away from the checkpoint, moving in the direction she had just been given, there was no visible sign that anything unusual had occurred. Her pace remained steady, her expression unchanged, her posture composed. To anyone observing from a distance, it would have appeared as though the interaction had ended exactly as expected. But what no one at that entrance realized was that the moment the conversation began, something else had already been set in motion. Without drawing attention, without interrupting the flow of the exchange, she had activated the voice recorder on her phone. The entire interaction, every word, every pause, every assumption, had been captured in real time. Not as a reaction, not as a defensive measure, but as part of something she had prepared for long before that morning. Instead of following the path toward the custodial briefing, Dr. Evelyn Carter adjusted her direction once she was out of immediate view, moving toward a secondary access point on the side of the building. From her bag, she retrieved a physical access card, one that wasn't issued to the general staff or even most senior personnel, but reserved for a very small number of individuals with the highest level of clearance tied to the facility's design and operation. The door responded instantly. No hesitation, no challenge, no uncertainty. It opened because the system recognized exactly who she was, even if the guard at the front did not. She stepped inside, the environment shifting from the stillness of the exterior to the controlled precision of a building designed for advanced work. And still, she didn't escalate. She didn't contact a supervisor. She didn't return to confront the guard. Instead, she moved with purpose, heading deeper into the facility as if everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Because in many ways, it was. Because 3 months earlier, she had already predicted this would happen. That realization reframes everything that came before it. The missed recognition, the assumption, the decision to comply. None of it was accidental from her perspective. It was observed, anticipated, and ultimately confirmed. What looked like a single moment of misjudgment was, in reality, a data point in a pattern she had been tracking with increasing precision. And now, for the first time inside this particular facility, that pattern had been documented under controlled conditions. The significance of that would not be understood immediately by the people involved. But for Dr. Evelyn Carter, the outcome of that morning had just provided exactly what she needed. By the time Dr. Evelyn Carter reached her office, the building had begun to come alive around her, but her focus remained fixed on something far more precise than the routine start of a workday. She set her bag down, took out her phone, and reviewed the recording she had just captured, listening not as someone reliving an uncomfortable moment, but as someone verifying a result. Every word, every pause, every assumption aligned with what she had been tracking for months. Because this wasn't the first time she had walked into a professional space and been met with doubt before identification, or redirected based on perception rather than confirmation. Over the past 3 years, she had quietly documented incidents across multiple facilities, each one recorded, categorized, and analyzed with the same level of discipline she applied to her technical work. Dates, locations, language used, response patterns, all of it organized into a growing body of evidence that pointed towards something larger than isolated mistakes. What happened at the checkpoint that morning was not an outlier. It was part of a consistent pattern that appeared across different locations, different teams, and different environments, all operating under similar structures. Private security contractors, layered authority systems, and decision-making processes that relied heavily on rapid judgment created conditions where perception could override protocol. Dr. Evelyn Carter had recognized that pattern early, but recognition alone was not enough. She needed proof that could stand on its own, proof that could not be dismissed as anecdotal or subjective. That is why she had begun documenting each incident with care, building a record that could be examined, challenged, and ultimately understood within a broader context. This moment, at this facility, was not random. It was a controlled test, conducted in an environment she knew intimately, under conditions she could anticipate. This wasn't frustration, it was data collection. That distinction is what shifted the entire narrative. She was not reacting to the system, she was studying it. And now, with this latest recording, she had added another layer to a dataset that was already difficult to ignore. But as she reviewed the interaction, one detail stood out more than anything else, something that went beyond the words themselves. Because the most revealing part of what had just happened wasn't in what the guard said, but in how quickly the decision was made, how confidently it was delivered, and how little space there was for reconsideration once the assumption had taken hold. And the most important piece of evidence wasn't what he said. By 8:05 a.m., the tone inside the facility had shifted in a way that only a few people fully understood. What had begun as a quiet morning was now moving towards something far more deliberate. A meeting request had been sent out with minimal explanation, pulling in the security supervisor, a regional manager from the contracting firm, and a legal representative tied to the facility's operational oversight. The location was a conference room on the first floor, a space designed for briefings and decision-making, where conversations were expected to be clear, structured, and documented. When Dr. Evelyn Carter entered, she carried no visible frustration, no urgency, nothing that suggested confrontation. She took her seat calmly, placed a folder on the table, and waited until everyone else had settled before she began to speak. The guard from the checkpoint sat across from her, no longer operating from a position of certainty, but from one of growing awareness that something had shifted. His supervisor stood nearby, posture tight, already sensing that this was not a routine discussion. The regional manager, brought in quickly after a brief call, appeared composed on the surface, but his attention moved carefully between Dr. Evelyn Carter and the documents in front of her. There was no raised voice, no accusation, just a steady progression of facts. She began by sliding a printed document across the table, directing their attention to a specific section. It was the contract that governed the security firm's responsibilities within the facility, a document they were all familiar with in general terms, but not necessarily in detail. She asked for a passage to be read aloud, and as the words filled the room, the weight of them became clear. The clause outlined expectations around access verification, professional conduct, and the consequences tied to decisions made without procedural justification. Once the reading ended, she introduced the second element. Without dramatics, she played the recording from that morning. The room fell into a quiet that was difficult to ignore as the interaction unfolded exactly as it had occurred, without interpretation, without commentary. Every assumption, every dismissal, every moment where protocol could have corrected perception but didn't, was presented plainly. When the audio stopped, she did not immediately speak. She allowed the silence to settle, giving each person in the room space to process what they had just heard. The shift in control was unmistakable. What had begun as a routine act of authority at the checkpoint had now been reframed within the very system that granted that authority in the first place. And then, when she did speak, her tone remained consistent with everything she had demonstrated up to that point. There was no anger, no attempt to diminish the individual involved. Instead, she focused on the structure itself, on how decisions were made, and why those decisions mattered beyond a single moment. She explained the pattern she had been documenting, the consistency across different locations, and the implications of allowing perception to override protocol. The guard listened, not as someone being confronted, but as someone being shown a process he had not fully understood. That distinction changed the dynamic of the entire room. Because she wasn't positioning herself against him, she was positioning the system in front of him. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to fix the system." The statement landed with a clarity that carried more weight than any accusation could have. It reframed the situation from personal fault to structural failure, from a single mistake to a repeatable issue that required correction. And in that moment, the balance of authority shifted completely. The same system that had been used to deny her entry was now being examined, line by line, by the person who had helped create it. What followed in that room moved beyond explanation and into decision. Dr. Evelyn Carter reached into the folder she had placed on the table and introduced a document none of them had seen before, a structured protocol built from the very patterns she had spent years documenting. It wasn't a reaction drafted overnight. It was detailed, measured, and aligned with the same level of precision she had applied to the facility itself. The protocol outlined clear requirements, mandatory verification steps before access denial, real-time incident logging tied directly to facility leadership, and enforced accountability measures when perception overrode procedure. It also included something the regional manager immediately recognized as significant: financial consequences tied directly to noncompliance. Not abstract penalties, but enforceable terms that could impact the company's standing within federal contracts. The room shifted again, this time not with uncertainty, but with the realization that the situation had already moved beyond internal discussion. The legal representative reviewed the language carefully, recognizing that the structure of the protocol was not only sound, but actionable under existing contract frameworks. This wasn't a proposal that needed months of revision. It was something that could be implemented immediately. The regional manager understood what that meant. Compliance would not be optional, and refusal would carry consequences far greater than the incident that had triggered the meeting. Because this was no longer about a single interaction at a checkpoint. It was about whether the system itself would adapt or remain exposed to the same failure moving forward. Dr. Evelyn Carter made it clear that the intent was not to terminate the relationship, but to strengthen it under conditions that ensured the issue could not repeat itself. The company would retain its position, but only if it agreed to adopt the protocol in full, with oversight mechanisms that extended beyond the facility. The decision, when it came, was not delayed. Faced with the structure in front of them, the documented evidence, and the contractual implications, the regional manager agreed to move forward. The document was signed in that room, transforming what had started as a brief moment of misjudgment into a formal shift in operational standards. And as the agreement was finalized, the broader impact began to take shape. Because once implemented at a facility of that scale, under federal oversight, the protocol would not remain isolated for long. It would be reviewed, referenced, and eventually adopted in other environments facing the same structural risks. What had occurred that morning was no longer confined to a single location or a single company. It had become a model for change. One assumption became a national standard. By the time the public ceremony began later that morning, the atmosphere outside the facility carried none of the tension that had defined the hours before it. Officials gathered, introductions were made, and the event unfolded with the kind of structure expected from a project of that scale. When Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped forward to speak, there was no indication in her tone that anything unusual had taken place earlier that day. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't dramatize the moment, and she didn't single anyone out. Instead, she described the system. She spoke about access, about how decisions are made in environments where authority must operate quickly, and how even well-designed structures can produce flawed outcomes when human perception goes unexamined. She explained that the strength of any system is not measured by how well it performs under ideal conditions, but by how it responds when those conditions are tested. What made her words resonate was not the incident itself, but what it represented. A single moment, lasting only minutes, had revealed a weakness that existed far beyond one building. And rather than allowing that moment to pass as an isolated mistake, it had been used to build something stronger in its place. The protocol introduced that morning would not remain confined to that facility. It would move outward, reviewed by administrators, adopted by other institutions, and eventually integrated into broader operational standards. What began as a quiet exchange at a security checkpoint had become a catalyst for change across systems that many people rarely think about, but rely on every day. And in that shift, there was something larger than policy or procedure. There was a reminder that leadership is not defined by position alone, but by the willingness to confront weaknesses and correct them with clarity and purpose. Accountability, when applied correctly, does not weaken a system, it reinforces it. And legacy is not built through avoiding mistakes, but through how those mistakes are understood and transformed. Dr. Evelyn Carter did not need to raise her voice to make that point. The outcome spoke for itself. Because systems don't fail by accident, they fail by design. So the real question is, what actually changed that day? Was it just one company adjusting its policies, one facility refining its procedures, one moment corrected and filed away as progress? Or was it something deeper than that? Something that extends far beyond a single checkpoint, a single decision, or a single person standing at a door making a judgment in seconds? Because if a system designed with precision, funded at the highest level, and operated under strict protocols could still allow perception to override facts so easily, then what does that say about every other system built the same way? And more importantly, how many times does it happen where no one is there to document it? No one is there to challenge it, and no one is there to turn that moment into something that leads to change? Dr. Evelyn Carter didn't just correct a mistake that morning. She exposed a pattern, one that had likely existed long before that facility opened, and would have continued long after if left unexamined. She didn't rely on confrontation, and she didn't rely on authority alone. She relied on evidence, structure, and timing. And because of that, one brief interaction became something far more significant than anyone at that checkpoint could have imagined. So the real question is, how many doors are still being guarded by assumptions instead of facts?